Hello again, everybody, and welcome to the Backbone Podcast, where common sense still makes sense in a world that is sick and getting sicker. And tonight, as promised, we are going to do a rewind of the Man of Steel film that came out in the year 2013. That's incredibly 12 years ago. Where did the time go by? This film, of course, is the introduction of the Henry Cavill Superman interpretations and his storyline of Superman. And this movie, even though people still kind of were like, uh, 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 this movie was pretty darn good. I thought Cavill was, by the looks of him, he had the look, he had the demeanor, he had that boyish charm, that innocence. He had everything that Clark Kent you needed to portray Clark Kent, and he had everything you needed to portray Superman. He just fit the role perfectly. And Henry Cavill, of course, in my estimation, should be James Bond as well. But I don't think that's going to happen. But in 2013, of course, Man of Steel was released. This was a Zack Snyder film. David Goyer wrote it. It was developed and produced by none other than Christopher Nolan. Now, Christopher Nolan had done the Dark Knight trilogy, which was tremendous. Finally, somebody took superhero films seriously, and I think this leveled up Marvel's production value of their phases in their superhero films. But this movie was stacked. It was stacked. I think DC finally took the reboot of Superman very seriously because they saw what you could do with Batman. And they went right back to the origin story, but they didn't do it in a way that all other movies have their origin stories for their superheroes. This film not only starred Henry Cavill, but it had Amy Adams, who was really riding high at the time, Kevin Costner, major star, Diane Lane, major star, Lawrence Fishburne, major star, and they even had Academy Award-winning Russell Crowe, who played Jor-El. And this film had acting chops. It was written okay, but it was a comic book movie. It was true to what the Superman universe is. And in the film, Clark Kent, of course, learns that he's the superpowered alien from Krypton, and he assumes the role of mankind's ultimate protector in Superman. And he, of course, makes the choice to face General Zod, who was uh, portrayed by Michael Shannon, who at the time was a very hot actor, especially because of the fact that he was on the Great Boardwalk Empire. Now, development for Man of Steel began in 2008. Warner Brothers was very, very tentative about going back to Superman because in 2006, as we know, Superman Returns came out, and it didn't do very well. It was just a boring, bad film. It had nothing to do with Brandon Routh. I thought he looked like Superman. He had the boyish look. He had he could do the bumbling alter ego Clark Kent. He did it very well. The director stunk. Plain and simple. The film was just boring. The story was bad. The direction was awful. And they gave that film to the wrong guy. And Warner Brothers was hell bent on not doing this again because now movies were becoming much more expensive. You're talking about $150, $250 million films now, and they were not going to risk a disaster. And they had Nolan. They had Nolan who went about making these superhero films the right way. And what did they do? What did Warner Brothers do? What did Nolan do? They took pitches from comic book writers and even comic book animation screenwriters. They took people who knew the business, who knew the characters better than anybody else, and they sat them down and said, tell us how to do this. Tell us how to do this the right way." And they didn't go for just any old screenwriters or any old comic book people. They went for Grant Morrison, Mark Waid, Geoff Johns, and they all pitched a version of Superman that would have been awesome. Wade said, I'm sorry, Morrison had the idea of using a similar work to what he wrote called All Star Superman. All Star Superman was tremendous, a tremendous comic novel. If you've never read it, you should. It's fantastic. Wade suggested using Superman Birthright, equally incredible. And they wanted to team up with other comic book people and other comic book directors, and they wanted to develop an epic. I think it would have been like 9 or 10 hour trilogy, akin to almost what Lord of the Rings was. And they wanted to have it start to finish. Superman's origin story, his fights against evil. They would have introduced Zod, Brainiac, Lex Luthor, and they probably would have tried to implement some of the crossover characters like Batman, Aquaman, Arrow, Flash, Wonder Woman especially, etc. Warner Brothers backed off on that because it was just it would have been too big of too big of a risk. Lord of the Rings was too big of a risk. So they balked on it. They balked on it because Superman Returns was so disappointing. You have to remember, in August of 2008, Warner Brothers had already planned a sequel for Superman Returns to be directed by Bryan Singer. But studio executives balked at that. They were ready to release the sequel in 2010, but they balked at it. And I remember an interview with Jeff Robinoff saying, Superman Returns didn't work as a film. It didn't position the character the way he should have been positioned. Had Superman worked, I'm paraphrasing here, we would have had a Christmas film in 2009. The plan was to totally reintroduce Superman without regard to a Batman Superman film at all. So Batman Superman wasn't even in anybody's mind at that time. A lot of people thought that because of the success of the Dark Knight trilogy, I should say, that the Superman reboot was possible. And people believed that Superman, let's be honest, he's a much bigger superhero than Batman is. But Batman, those films are so engaging that everyone was waiting for a Superman film to be produced and to give it the justice it deserved. And they planned on it. They spoke to these writers, they spoke to these comic book people, and they finally got a director who understood graphic novels and comic books, and that guy's name was Zack Snyder. Now, many people shit on Zack Snyder. They say his movies are overblown and overproduced and yada 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 yada. The guy gets it. He just gets it. He's not looking for, to outsmart the audience or to make the audience think. Comic book movies, comic books, and comic book films are about action, power, fantasy. That's what we want. And that's what he gave us. And it worked. It just worked. It worked for Man of Steel. It worked for Batman versus Superman. It worked for those Flash films. It worked for, Justice League. It just worked. Now people were disappointed with those other films, but again, Superman is held in such a high regard that it's almost impossible to get comic book fans, especially Superman fans who are so polarizing, to ever sit down and agree, yeah, this was great. People are always going to say, well, Superman wouldn't have done this, Superman wouldn't have done that. The origin story wasn't quite the way the canon went. And of course, the controversial ending, people just gave up on it. They were like, fuck this. This is not my Superman. And yeah, the ending was a bit shocking. But did it kill the film? Did it kill the potential franchise? No, of course not. The film was a little different in terms of it was not your traditional origin story. The film was shot and produced in a non-linear way. So Superman's childhood and his teenage years weren't told in a linear fashion. They were told in a collection of flashbacks. So we start off, as usual, on the planet Krypton. It's destabilized. And it's not destabilized from the red planet, burning out. Now we are more political at the time because of global warming and climate change and all this shit. And the planet was dying because of excess mining. So just before the planet explodes, Jor-El, Russell Crowe, steals and infuses the genetic codex into his new son, Kal-El, who is in this film the first naturally born Kryptonian in centuries. Right? They were artificially, producing Kryptonians, and Jor-El manages to send Kal-El in a spacecraft towards Earth before he was eventually killed in a battle with Zod. General Zod, of course, conducts a coup d'état because he wants to control the planet, and he tries to shoot down Kal-El's spacecraft, but the Kryptonian military stops him, and he's arrested, and he's sent into the Phantom Zone. Not just Zod or Ursa or Nan, but a bunch of other Zod loyalists. So Kal-El, of course, flies through space. He lands in Kansas, and he's adopted by Jonathan and Martha Kent. And Kevin Costner and Diane Lane are incredibly great in this movie. Costner is great in everything. And for finally DC, or for finally any of these films, to move away from the old senior citizen parents raising these kids, like in Spider-Man, like in the Superman trilogy, Superman canon, they made them a little younger, and you had this beautiful Diane Lane who's Martha Kent, and you had this, Kevin Costner, this freaking cowboy, he looks like the Marlboro Man there, and they just dominate the screen. Now, you can argue that Marvel did the same thing with the Spider-Man series because when they had Aunt May, they didn't cast an old woman for Aunt May. They casted the gorgeous Melissa Tomei, which just made it just so much cooler and better. So as he grows due to his Kryptonian biology and Earth's yellow sun, he develops these superhuman powers that his father urges him to keep hidden. And in one scene, there's a bus accident, a school bus accident, a school bus that Clark Kent now Clark Kent, if it crashes into a river or into a into a river, and Clark saves all the children from drowning. Jonathan Kent is now talking to a parent who says that they saw, or their child saw, Clark pick up the bus out of the water and save them, that this is providence, right? And Jonathan kind of scolds Clark a little bit, and he suggests that Clark should have let these kids die in order to save his identity, which a lot of people, a lot of critics, and a lot of fans thought that's fucked up. That's kind of macabre, Johnny. But Jonathan Kent wasn't a hypocrite because Jonathan Kent in canon dies of a heart attack or dies of old age. This interpretation of Jonathan Kent doesn't die of a heart attack. He refuses Clark's help during a tornado storm, and that's how he loses his life. This sets Clark off to the break from growing up in Smallville and leaving for Metropolis right away to him traveling the globe under different aliases and seeking his own purpose in life. He's so guilt-ridden that he can't be around Smallville anymore. But while he's doing this, he is performing miracles. He's saving everybody. He saves a scout ship in the Arctic, and he saves these guys on this oil tanker or oil rig. He's just doing all this crazy shit, and it's very, very similar to the stories or the years of absence that we know of Jesus, right? This guy roams around. We lose track of him for many, many years, and he's performing these miracles in places. And then we find him later on, once he's not Clark Kent anymore, we find out he's Superman. That's when he emerges again. With all of these great things that are happening, all these unusual things that are happening, the Daily Planet, of course, Lois Lane receives an assignment to investigate the discovery of a Kryptonian scout ship in the Arctic. This is where Clark Kent and Lois Lane first meet, not at the Daily Planet. Again, break from canon, which people were pissed off about. Clark enters the ship disguised as a worker, and he learns from the AI modules there, or the AI models, modeled after his father Jor-El. It's programmed to tell Clark his origins, and of course, why Clark was sent to Earth. He's there to guide people, yada yada yada. Well, Lois, being the nosy broad that she is, she follows Clark into the ship, and she triggers the ship's security system, and she gets stabbed by its like stinger, and she's about to die. He uses his powers. He uses his powers to rescue her, and he is then given the uniform, the iconic uniform, which is much different than the other uniforms that Superman had worn, the Superman suit. This one had more of a industrial look, like a chain link type look. And the ship begins testing his abilities. Now, Lois goes back home. She's trying to convince Perry White to publish an article of the incident. Of course, Perry White refuses, so Lois goes about herself and tracks down Clark Kent in Smallville with the intent of exposing him. Now, Lois drops a story upon hearing of Jonathan Kent's sacrifice, and she keeps Clark's identity safe while fueling speculation and suspicions from Perry White in the at the Daily Planet. Now, the activation of the ship, right, triggers Zod and his crew in the Phantom Zone. Now, they've been imprisoned there for treason. They travel to Earth, and their whole ambition is not to conquer Earth or rule Earth. Their whole ambition is to turn Earth into a new Krypton. And they have these terraforming devices that they found in other Kryptonian outposts in the universe. I forgot, world engines they were called. And they were going to completely destroy humanity. He was a genocidal maniac in this one, Zod. And they were going to start Krypton all over again. Now, Clark and Lois are captured by Zod. I'm moving forward a lot. And Zod extracts some of Clark's genes so they can create a new Kryptonian race, and they want to build society based on Zod's ideals. They use Jor-El's AI to take over the ship. Clark and Lois flee and warn the U.S. military of Zod's plans, resulting in a confrontation between Superman and Zod's troops, which they're in Smallville. They're tearing the shit out of this freaking town. Then they tear the shit out of Metropolis. Zod then deploys his most powerful device, the World Engine, and he almost completely destroys Metropolis and almost completely destroys humanity. Clark destroys this World Engine while the military is, trying to launch an attack on these Kryptonian machines, and they're failing, of course, in the beginning. They eventually blow up this this terraforming platform called the Black Zero, and this sends Zod's troops back to the Phantom Zone. And with the ship destroyed and Krypton's only hope of revival gone, Zod vows to destroy Earth and its inhabitants out of pure vengeance. And Superman and Zod are now engaged in a epic battle across Metropolis, which concludes with the most controversial part of the whole movie, Clark, or Superman, killing Zod as Zod tries to attack a family trapped in a train station with his heat vision. Now, Clark is not Superman at this point. He adapts the moniker of Superman and persuades the government to let him act independently. He shoots down a drone, and the military's all pissed off at him. And under the conditions that he does not turn against humanity, he says, "I'll help when I can, but everything will stay the same. Humanity will rule and judge itself." He then takes a job as Clark Kent under his civilian identity at the Daily Planet, where at the end of the movie, he's introduced by Perry White to Lois Lane, and Lois Lane, of course, pretends she doesn't know who he is or anything like that, and that's how the film ends. Now, was this film This film had a 57% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, um, which means that it was kind of, I think you have to have 60 or over. Um, so it wasn't liked by critics. The film to me was much better than that. Was it better than the Dark Knight trilogy? The No, no. The Dark Knight, the second film in the Dark Knight trilogy, was one of the great superhero films of all time. I mean, the performances there were great. The Joker is an iconic villain. Zod is not an iconic villain in the Superman universe. He's not even really the main villain in the Superman universe. I mean, there are probably four or five villains that come before him that, at the top of my head, I could think are better than Zod. But they use Zod here, and they used him pretty well. I mean, Zod was more militant in this one. He was more genocidal than the Terrence Stamp interpretation, where Terrence Stamp was more of a regal character. He wanted to rule like a king. But I thought people just, their expectations were much too high, and they just don't give the dude a break. And the theme of the film is very religious. There's a part in the film where Clark is in Smallville and he's sitting in church and he's speaking to I don't know if he was a priest or a preacher, and they're kind of like in the pews in front of each other. Clark is behind the priest and the priest is in front of Clark. And every time you see the Clark comes into frame, there are wings behind him to symbolize that he's an angel, or to symbolize that he's holy in some way. The Man of Steel has religious undertones, especially since Warner Brothers had set up a website that contained a pamphlet entitled Jesus is the Original Superhero. Many people say that Kal-El's or Clark Kent's struggle is akin to the Passion of the Christ, stating that, Clark is willing to sacrifice himself to save the people of the planet Earth. Jesus sacrificed himself to save the people of the planet Earth. Originally, he's reluctant to show his identity and his powers to the world. Jesus was reluctant to do the same. Superman turns himself over to Zod to save humanity from annihilation. Jesus turns himself over to the Pharisees and then the Romans to save humanity from the sins of the world. Jor-El kind of returns as a ghost, an AI ghost, if you will, as he guides his son, this superhero, on his journey to salvation. Jor-El sends his son off to Earth, much like in the story of Moses, right? Kal-El is supposed to die on Krypton. Moses was supposed to die at the hands of the Pharaoh's orders to kill the firstborn sons. So he tells his wife, we have to save our boy to save our lineage. Jor-El in this film tells his wife that, like Jesus, not that he mentioned Jesus, of course, but Jor-El, the Russell Crowe character, tells his wife they'll see him as a god on planet Earth, which we do, which in that universe they do. There's also an iconic scene where Superman is floating in space with his arms open, sort of like being nailed to the cross. How old is Superman in this film? 33. And as I mentioned before, there's a scene of him in church. He seeks counsel at the church. Now, many people look at Zod and say, well, Zod is like many of the terrible tyrants of the past. Genghis Khan, maybe Napoleon, even Julius Caesar. Some people compared him to Hitler because he felt that his version of Krypton is the only answer for survival. Right, the Kryptonians were the super race. Which philosopher had said that? Was it Nietzsche who came up with the term Ubermensch, Superman? This was something that Hitler, they say, believed. Hitler did envision having a eugenics program, much like what the Spartans had. The Spartans never took or never allowed any of their citizens to be handicapped in any sort of way. If you were born a certain way, they left you on the mountaintop to die. So there are religious undertones to the Superman film, and there are tyrannical, tyrant undertones to the villain, especially here with Zod. He's very militant, genocidal. He believes in eugenics, yada yada yada. But the film to me works. The cast works. Costner was a great Jonathan Kent. Diane Lane was a great Martha Kent. Amy Adams was meh, but to me it worked. And I thoroughly enjoyed it. I took the kids. I remember my kids were small at the time, and they loved it. The suit was great. Cavill was great. The breakaway from canon was worked for me, and the fact that they went non-linear, we didn't go into a linear origin story, was different, and it worked. It was great. It really really worked. It was refreshing to see. So I give Man of Steel 3 S's. The Superman the movie got 4 S's. Superman 2 with Zod got 5 S's. This gets 3. This was pretty good. It was pretty good. Now, what led to this? Well, tomorrow night, I'll show you. Because I believe that even though Marvel, as I said this before, even though Marvel probably won the superhero movie war or battle, they lost a lot of battles terribly to DC in animation, video games, animation television, and of course, live action television. They have no answer for them, and they lose in comic books. They have no answer for those in those different fields. Now, of course, nobody really in the mainstream cares because movies are bigger than all those things combined, except for television. But what brought Superman back, what made Clark Kent special again, was the television show Smallville. And we'll discuss Smallville tomorrow. And we'll discuss what Warner Brothers and the CW did by creating this universe phase. They call it the Arrowverse, which had the crossovers and all that, and it was fucking great. But to me, it was the Smallville verse. They didn't have the crossover of well, they did. They did. They had the introduction of these superheroes like Flash and other superheroes, Aquaman. But they did it in a different way. They had them all as teenagers. They didn't really know their powers too well. They were kind of bad in the beginning until Clark straightens them out. But they introduce a lot of villains. They show you the villains, or a lot of villain origin stories. And they had, of course, the famous Freak of the Week, because there was always a freak that Clark had to save his friends from and save Smallville from. But that is for tomorrow. I hope you enjoyed this one. I hope you're enjoying Superman Week. I hope you're waiting, and I hope you have your tickets to see the man on Friday or Saturday or Sunday or anytime this weekend, because it will be. I think this is going to be a great film. I'm hoping, because the hype is just incredible. Now it's certified fresh. It's got a big, 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 big hype machine behind it. They're predicting a lot of money being made this weekend. So let's see. But anyway, how do we leave you? Thanks again for watching. Please like, subscribe, comment, and share. Be careful out there, my friends. Satan is always, always, always busy. Be a man. Have a backbone, because masculinity and common sense are worth standing up for. We'll see you later.